Thank you for all coming out today, and also thanks to General McCarthy, Bob Fiedler, and to James Freeman for all their first-rate support for us today. The second panel today is basically on defense economics and procurement, and kind of thematically we set this up as kind of at what cost for defense. And we have a very distinguished group here today to talk about these issues. To my right, your left, is Frank G. Hoffman. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where he did his undergraduate degree. His freshman year, he was a marine biology major until his report card came at the end of the first semester, and then just became a marine major. Frank is a retired Marine Corps Reserve Lieutenant Colonel. He served 10 years on active duty in the Fleet Marine Force and at Headquarters Marine Corps. He's the author of a very well-regarded book called, what was your book called again, Frank?
Yeah, so it's number 3 million on the Amazon series.
I'm just joking. It's Decisive Force, The New American Way of War, which was kind of a critique of the Powell Doctrine. More recently, he is the author of a very influential monograph called The Rise of Hybrid Wars, and all around a good guy and a partner of crime of mine for several years now. To his right, and to your left further, although not ideologically, is Mackenzie Eaglen from the Heritage Foundation. She is a senior policy analyst for defense and homeland security issues there. Before coming to Heritage, she worked on the Hill for Senator Collins, Susan Collins of Maine, and she also worked on the House side with, it's in your bios there. I apologize. Last but not least, we have our Navy representation here, Dr. Chris Preble, a retired commander in the United States Navy. Also,
you gave me a huge promotion.
Lieutenant Commander. Any event, he holds a PhD in diplomatic history from Temple University, which is near and dear to our hearts in Philadelphia. And without further ado, Frank.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to do this from here. Thank you for the introduction. I'd like to thank our host and co-sponsor ROA and General McCarthy for their leadership here in town. I'd particularly like to thank FPRI and its sponsors. You put together a very timely and relevant package here with quite a number of experts, and me and Mac and some others, a couple of characters here in the room too. Also, but as a dues-paying member of both organizations, if you'd like to pick up some brochures and you like the work that we're doing, we'd be glad to have some more members. My paper deals with an arcane subject of defense economics. Not too interesting a topic, and not often a topic for panels like this. If economics can be called the dismal science, and I took my first degree as in training as an economist, then the Pentagon's books are a cure for insomnia and the cause of mental depression for many of us in town who have to kind of work with it. There's an old saying in the military audiences that amateurs talk strategy and tactics, and it's the professionals that talk logistics. But here in Washington, the amateurs actually talk about policy and strategy, and it's the professionals that talk about dollars. Glossy policy statements are really nice, but they really take second fiddle to minute details about total obligational authority, real versus current program strength, current dollars versus inflated dollars, that kind of level of detail and budget outlays. That's what really drives things here. There's only one major code in Washington, D.C. when it comes to strategy, and it's always follow the money. Nope, here we go. This is going to come as a little bit of surprise to the two panelists who've read my paper, but I actually believe that there's a structure to the paper. It has two halves. In the front half of the paper, I try to deal with how much is enough for defense. And there's a debate in the paper that talks about how much should be allocated to defense. And some of our panelists are advocates and antagonists on that level. And I'll do some economic comparison, and unfortunately that's going to be a lot of graphics, because if you're trained as an economist, you can tell stories with pictures and graphs rather than words, so you'll be stuck with that. In the second half, I'll address some of the issues that also came up in the earlier discussion about how I would allocate scarce defense resources to shape the future force as a guide for what we need to do in the future. Now, there's a very important speech that Mr. Gates gave, and he's published as an essay in Foreign Affairs recently. He's basically challenged the Department of Defense and the military services. And this essay, I believe, represents Mr. Gates' personal vision and the stamp that he wants to put on the department during his tenure, and especially during the upcoming QDR. And in this essay and in his speeches, Mr. Gates has declared that the defining principle of the Pentagon's national defense strategy is the principle of balance, whatever that means. Mr. Gates' insistence that the department return to the basics of strategic planning rather than overwhelming force supported by unlimited resources is actually heartening to me. So too is understanding that the essence of strategy is the ability to make decisions with scarce resources, with risk assessments, and with constrained dollars. Too often in Washington, the meaning of strategy has become lost. Some claim, in fact, that we've forgotten the entire art of strategic logic, and we can no longer establish and maintain relationship between ends and means. In the words of two theorists in town, Barry Watts and Andy Krapenovich, we've forgotten how to, quote, choose realistic goals and craft strategies likely to achieve our objectives at affordable costs in the face of various constraints. So I like this concept of balance that Mr. Gates has established. It's important, but perhaps it's incomplete. Our panel this morning, first panel, talked about two of these forms of balance, the near-term balance versus long-term investments, and the balance between regular and irregular warfare. Very current today and very important. However, we actually have a number of other balancing acts that we also must address. Manpower versus technology came up in one of the questions today. How much should be spent on boots on the ground to fight current conflicts? How much should be invested in technology that affords our troops and soldiers and Marines the ability to succeed without being placed at risk? And firepower versus manpower risks are at the essence of the future debate about the defense budget. There's also an issue about military versus non-military investments. One of the most obvious imbalances we have today is between a Pentagon with $600 or $700 billion a year and the other agencies that have something on the order of $40 billion, a 17-to-1 ratio. That's a balance we might need to address. I'll get a point here from my friend. You know, a whole-of-government approach actually requires a budgeting approach that gets in the whole of government. We don't have that today. And there's a panel this afternoon that will cover that in detail, so we won't need to. There's a balance between prevention and response. Right now, we're well prepared, well stocked, and well organized to fight wars. We're not as invested in preventing wars, and that could be a separate discussion as well. There's a balance between expeditionary tasks of fighting wars into the away game, and there's tasks here at home. Right now, the Pentagon doesn't interest itself, understandably, I think, with the current fight, but in the long run, right now the balance is a little bit out of whack, and it reflects a overwhelming faith in the Department of Homeland Security. I might want to address that balance. And then finally, the most important balance, the subject of this panel, is available resources versus our appetite in the Pentagon. The greatest imbalance in the national security framework today is the lack of relationship between the Pentagon's accounts and the funds that are reasonably available for the future, and the ones that we're willing to pay and tax ourselves to provide. As one defense intellectual has put it, our leaders have proven unable and unwilling to address the disparity between how much we want and what we can afford to pay, unquote. This is acceptable in crises like now, supplemental fundings and deficit spending, but it is not a long-term way of doing business in the future. Ultimately, the Pentagon's program has to be both balanced, as Mr. Gates has said, but it must also be sustainable, a second principle that I'm going to come to several times in my presentation. Now, gauging how much is necessary for the Defense Department is kind of an art. It's not a science. There's a couple of very good arguments about how much we should spend on defense, but you're never going to come to probably an agreement with any kind of scientific precision. You know, we have a broad range of threats, as we discussed in the first panel. This aspect of this debate that we're currently having in Washington about how much of the gross domestic product, the GDP, that we should allocate to defense is kind of at the crux of this. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but there are actually several valid arguments which I've listed here that I believe, you know, substantiate the use of GDP as a crude but effective measure for understanding how much we're actually investing in defense. I won't need to spend any time on this because my fellow panelist here is probably much more articulate than I at covering her argument. But I do want to suggest that this kind of a spending level, this kind of a high level as a metric right now, I think is actually hitting the easy button for DOD. And I'm going to take, I think, what is a more challenging argument and go a little bit further and actually advocate for a lower level of defense spending over time. Because I'm a Marine, I'm going to hit a different button so I don't offend anybody. Instead of hitting an easy button, I want to use a different button. There's a lot of arguments that can be raised against a proposed level of 4% of defense, which equates, I think, to about $600 billion in today's spending. And there's 4 major counters. I argue that it's astrategic. I think we need to look at the Defense Department within a national security framework that's much larger than just military spending. The homeland, the interagency, the State Department, public diplomacy, prevention. Mr. Gates has acknowledged this in his speeches. This isn't news to him or anybody here in Washington, and I'll let this afternoon's panel kind of address this. It is somewhat inaccurate in the arguments right now about defense spending because we're having an argument between relative and absolute spending. And it's absolutely true that our relative spending on defense as a percentage of what we could afford has gone down. But as I'll show you later, in real inflation-accounted terminology, we're actually spending quite a bit more than we have in the past, and we're spending a lot of money. Whether it's enough is still a debate that we can have during the Q&A. It's also ahistoric. We're comparing past periods of time, like the Cold War, to today, and we're conflating the kinds of threats, which I think are very different. We're conflating a different government and a very, very different economy than we've had over 40 or 50 years. So we need to get some apples and apples understanding of where we are today. And then lastly, I think we're going to reward some mismanagement in the Pentagon if we throw some more money at it. And rather than having being shortchanged by the taxpayer, I think DOD has shortchanged the taxpayer themselves by not credibly applying the resources that has been given to it in an effective and efficient manner. And I'll spend a little bit of time on that today. But the essence is we need to return to the basics of strategic planning. And I'm not calling anybody here a dummy. Okay, because I'm an economist, you know, I have to talk in graphs. And this is where we have been, and this is where we are currently going. Will I bother the camera if I get up? Scare anybody? Okay, talk this way and I can grab this. Okay, we came out of World War II owing the world and ourselves 120% of our gross domestic product. That's a very high level. That was a lot of debt. It was necessary for World War II. It was a temporary measure. And we came out of World War II as the world's largest manufacturing base. 50% of the world's output was produced by us, and we were the largest creditor in the world. We had a lot of cash. And over time, the percentage of our debt came down despite Korea, and it had this long period of time that our national debt as a percentage of our economy shrunk, again, because our economy was growing very, very efficiently. And then after the Iranian crisis, you know, we have this huge buildup. And what's happened over the last few decades is we have our debt increasing significantly over our ability to gross domestic product. And we are coming back here in the next 4 years. We're going to be back at the same level we were in 1946, probably around 2012 to 2014. We will have a national debt that is 120% of our gross domestic product. In the last 8 years, we almost doubled our national debt from 5.7. Got it up here to 10.6 when Mr. Bush left. It's over 11 today. And a couple $billion adds on while I'll be talking here today to the national debt because we are spending more than we produce, we're consuming more than we make, we're allocating and expending more than we can produce and spend. Do you see the sharp spike here at the end? At the very end, you know, we borrowed $1 trillion for the war. We borrowed $500 billion to increase defense capabilities very effectively. We're borrowing $1 trillion for a financial recovery act that's probably going to be a bottomless pit. And the Congress is now allocating something on the order of $0.8 trillion for some more stimulus and recovery. And that's what's exacerbating that curve. It's going to go up. So we've had an 80% increase in national debt over the last 8 years. We are probably going to see another very significant increase in national debt and then interest payments at the same time here in the next 4 to 6 years. We're building a big hole. The difference in the past is when we get to the other side of this, we knew there was an ending to World War II. And right now we're not 50% of the world's gross domestic output. We're 20% and declining. And we're not the world's greatest creditor nation. We're not flush with cash that we're borrowing or loaning to people to make investments. We're sucking all that money in because we're the world's largest debtor. So getting out of this mountain on the other side is going to be something that's very, very difficult for us to achieve. And we're probably not going to do that without doing some severe damage. And I'm very afraid why we had this particular topic on the panel is that we will damage things in the Defense Department, particularly the industrial base, when we get to that point in time. This is another way of looking at it. This shows the American economy in different categories. Here's the defense category. You can see it got squeezed a little bit during the so-called peace dividend period during the Clinton administration. You also saw the only surplus we've had in a long period of time, and now we're back into deficit spending. You see other aspects of the government increasing over time. You get to this huge bulge up here, entitlement growth, which is a demographic squeeze. The number of Americans who are going to be 65 and older and drawing benefits is going to double between now and 2030. We're going to go from 36 million to 72 million people, and they're going to want their Social Security check, and they're going to want their Medicaid and their Medicare. And the greatest threat to the economy and the economic base of the United States is certainly not the Pentagon. It's that bulge in the entitlements growth that we call entitlements. I don't like the term, nor I like the term mandatory. I don't believe it's mandatory, nor is it entitlement. It's a benefit that we voted for ourselves. And it needs to be seen as such, so it doesn't crimp things too much. This particular line right here is supposed to show where we are right now with, this is supposed to be the tax revenue line. This was produced by the Washington Post before the economic crisis. So the revenue is actually going to go down because the economy slowed. We're getting much less tax revenues. Interest is going to go up because we borrowed $2.5 trillion in the last 4 or 5 months. And so defense is going to be squeezed even more between the entitlement growth, interest payments on the debt, and the lower income that we're going to take in as a nation. So things are not looking very good for defense right now, which is why we're having this discussion today. But the long-term problem, when we get out here past 2030, is very, very dangerous because you see the accumulated debt, and you see this growing Medicaid and Medicare investment that's going to significantly impinge on things. This is not sustainable. This is something that Mr. Peterson, there's people in the GAO and people in government are trying to get their hands around, something Mr. Obama's promised to get his hands around. But it's going to be part of these hard calls in the future of restricting that kind of growth, getting our hands around medical and healthcare costs in this economy. There's another way of looking at it in 4 points in time. The first 3 columns reflect the federal budget and the blocks allocated to different aspects. This is what I mean by we're a different economy and a different federal budget today. In the yellow category, you see the percentage of the federal budget allocated to defense. And you'll see that in relative terms, we are spending less of the federal resources of the federal budget on defense over time. Although I've annotated in black letters there the actual inflation accounted real dollars, over current times, you can compare apples to apples. We're actually, in real terms, we're spending more money, but as a percentage of the federal budget, it's clearly going down. It's the red category that is the big cost driver, and that's the health care issue and the portion of the federal budget. It's gone from 1% during the Vietnam era up to 25% today and going to grow to 40% of the budget. You take this out to another column, 60 and 70% of the federal budget will become health care and Social Security. And it's going to squeeze out government, and it's going to squeeze out the Pentagon unless we do something about it. These are not good trends. This is the dismal science. Here's another way of looking at it. This is crucial for Mackenzie's argument as much as mine. The red line represents the percentage of GDP that's allocated to the Defense Department. So for World War II and for Korea, we mobilized. And over time, as our economy has gotten 6, 7, and 8 times bigger, we're not spending that kind of money on the military. So as a percentage, in relative terms, the amount of money we're allocating to the Defense Department has been going down as a percentage of the gross domestic product. The yellow category highlights DOD's budget, and again, in inflated dollars, so you compare apples to apples. Over time, we continue to spend pretty decent money. We've had an increase here, Desert Storm area, and then we have the Bush buildup and the current conflict. I'm arguing that this kind of growth, this is an inordinary increase relative to the kind of threats I think we face today, and that this level is not balanced and it's not sustainable given our strategic situation and our overall economic situation. But we're having a pretty high level. The red line up here at the far right on the top represents the 4% of GDP, which in a $15 trillion economy is the $600 billion line. And that $600 billion line would give the Pentagon everything it's asking for today, plus some, I think. But it would certainly provide a lot of resources to be able to do a lot of different things. And it would eliminate some risks. I mean, there's some argument to investing in the Defense Department, but that's the kind of level that 4% of GDP gives you. This is another comparison. This is a way of looking at our Defense Department in the left in the gray and how much money we're putting at DoD compared to the top 22 countries in the world. And you put them all together, and in this case, from the source, it comes from London, this is IISS's annual military balance, which gives China quite a bit of credit for purchasing parity kind of thing. This is not just, yuan versus dollars kind of a thing. So this is a very impressive comparison of the kind of resourcing allocation that we're moving along. And we're outspending pretty much the rest of the world equals to us. So I think we are investing quite a bit in defense. This is just a view of what we've done over the last few years. I want to make the highlight there that that big gray area. This is what we've borrowed in the last 8 years. That was kind of above the top line for the point in time for deficit spending. So the red category captures all the supplemental spending, and the gray is the baseline budget for DoD. And that big square, the circled area, oval area, is what we have put into deficit spending, for what we have borrowed for, and for what we're going to pay interest for the next few decades. I made a claim of mismanagement. This is from a GAO study. It highlights the fact that many programs in the Pentagon take quite a bit longer to produce. They have significant cost overruns. R&D costs have gone up 40%. Acquisition costs are up 26%. And the big programs, the major top programs, just between 2000 and 2007, are showing a cost overrun of $300 billion in 7 or 8 years. This is in an institution that only spends $100 billion a year for procurement investment. So basically in the last 8 years, cost overruns, decision-making, cost estimates, and perhaps mismanagement, a harsh word, has cost us 3 years of capital investment in the Pentagon. And it's not a happy story. And just throwing money at the problem is probably not going to be the solution. So I've made a big argument for strategic solvency. I'll skip this argument, but to me, strategy and foreign policy means bringing into balance the nation's power and the nation's commitments, and we've not done that. By any standard, our military strategy and our foreign policy is close to bankruptcy. Whatever grand vision the Obama administration wants to get at, I think the most important thing they have to do is to get us out of the red, metaphorically, strategically, economically, and militarily.
Frank, tell them who that is.
Well, it's Walter Lippmann, one of my gods. That's the Lippmann solvency test. So I'm making an argument in my paper for defense spending of about $460 billion a year. That would be a 10% reduction in real terms over today's level. That's a minor contribution, I think, to our economic issue. The bigger contribution is going to have to come from the rest of the government, and particularly from the entitlement programs. And some kind of ratio of 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, I think, would be a useful ratio to set up. For every $3 that comes out of entitlements and the rest of the government, you could hit the Pentagon for $1. As a point of reference, if you were to define defense spending at $460 billion, you would be providing a capability of outmatching the combined total of Russia's spending and China's spending with a 3 to 1 margin. And I think that would give us a surplus of power and reserve if it's effectively managed over time. What I call the triple two-enemy standard, for people who remember their British naval history. How to shape things. There's a couple of panaceas that are running around town. How could you possibly change DoD to deal with the new world? There's several arguments. More jointness. There's a lot of calls for that in Washington, D.C. If we have more joint bases, or if the services would interact with each other, we could save billions of dollars. I think that's a panacea. Roles and missions review, we do that every few years, and we get nothing out of that. Transformation is an argument that's argued that it'll somehow save billions of dollars, and that hasn't done very much. There's good reasons to transform. There's good reasons to rationalize roles and missions. It appears that saving money is not one of them, or any of them. And of course, you can't swing a dead cat in this town about every 5 years, and you get a call for acquisition reform. And again, I'll join that call. We need acquisition reform, but it hasn't saved us very much in the past. To me, they're all panaceas. There is no holy grail. And I'll take you back to Mr. Gates. The one thing we've known in this town is that the funding spigot is about to end. It's the time to force hard choices on DoD. I'm going to skip this portion, but in the paper, I did spend some time trying to, I thought it was, since I was calling for hard calls, I thought I had to make some hard calls myself and suggest where some of this funding cuts would come from to get us from 520 today down to 460. We need to change our foreign policy. We need to reduce foreign basing, particularly in Europe and Korea. We need to reduce strategic force levels, particularly in the nuclear realm. We need to reduce cuts in the Joint Strike Fighter. I call for something from a cut from 2,400 airplanes to something in the order of 1,500 or 1,600. I'm gutless about what service I allocate those cuts to. I'll admit that. We need to reshape the future combat system, as Colonel Hammes talked about this morning. I'd focus on ground programs and particularly on the force protection elements of that particular program and give up some of the other aspects. Colonel Hammes nailed it on the shipbuilding program. We have a Navy shipbuilding plan that requires $25 billion a year for the next 30 years. Problem is we only allocate 13, 14, or 15 of that problem. So every year we get another $10 billion behind in the plan. It's time to change the plan. Some aircraft carriers can be cut, I think, to help close that gap. And finally, we need to resize and reshape ground forces. And I'll save that for the Q&A because my moderator is screaming over here about time. Doesn't realize how much time we really have. Then I came up with what is perhaps a crude investment framework that, again, reflects some of the conversation we had earlier this morning about how I would allocate either the procurement money or the total obligational authority of the Pentagon to reshape it for the 21st century. And in the first column, I'm using basically DoD's quad chart to reflect 4 bins of investment that the current strategy, or at least the previous strategy, used to talk about. Traditional warfighting capabilities, which I've renamed to be multi-capable because of the hybrid threat and the need for multi-capable, or what Mac Owens has written about as flexible force structures. I don't want a traditional force structure. I want to put a premium on multi-capable and flexible forces. So that category I call multi-capable. We've got a strategic bin there that we need to buy. That's national missile defense, that's cyber warfare, and it's our strategic forces. Then we have the irregular capabilities. That's the SOF forces. It's also building partnership capacity and DoD's contribution to preventing conflicts. And I put that money out there for the services to compete with options to have a piece of that funding. And then finally, we have the disruptive technology, which comes also from the QDR. And that's basically our DARPA, our science and technology base, which traditionally has been about 3%. And what I've done in the last column is I've made a force crude allocation about how I would allocate that funding. So I would spend some more in science and technology because nano, bio, robotics, and directed energy are out there, and they are potentially disruptive, and we need to avoid strategic surprise. I make a significant investment shift in irregular capabilities, and I put a pot of money against that. I reduce the strategic forces a little bit so that I can increase some funding for the cyber warfare aspects and the space aspects on the space question. So that's a decrease overall in a percentage, but it's a shift within that box. And then the rest is allocated for multi-capable capabilities. So, kind of wrapping up, we know what the cost is of a very good book on strategy. We know what the cost is of a 5th-generation fighter. I happen to also know, in our minds at least, that we know that we can't continue on this path. We need to do something entirely differently. Our success in the Cold War required a tight correlation between strategic aims and resources. The strategy was crafted and executed by what I call successive smart hawks. Future success is going to require more smart hawks, and that we reacquire the ability to craft sustainable strategies and effectively implement them. A new era of smart hawks must relearn the art of strategy and regain our strategic solvency. Mr. Gates, in my view, is a smart hawk. He recognizes we can't eliminate all risk with more money. He's recognized the need for hard calls. Hopefully in the next budget cycle or two, he'll have an opportunity to implement those. DoD must set priorities. It must hedge against risks. It must manage those risks better, and it has to consider inescapable trade-offs. It must discipline itself and get better value out of its procurement dollars instead of calling for a bailout. As 2 very smart commentators who I expect to be working in OSD policy soon have put it, the next president and the Secretary of Defense will need to avoid strategic overstretch, and I'd argue we're there, and make difficult decisions about where to place emphasis and how to prudently balance risk. The current economic crisis, on top of a decade of deficit spending and a decade of foreign financing, has left us in a deep hole. And getting out of that hole is not going to be a simple or easy matter. Achieving a balanced and sustainable security posture is going to prove to be Mr. Obama's greatest challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That worked very well.
Oh, did? Okay.
Thanks, Frank. Mackenzie?
Well, I want to also thank our sponsors here today. It's a stellar conference they've put together, and I want to thank all of you as well. I want to begin my remarks without showing a slide. Actually, oftentimes being the minority voice in the room, it can create some fireworks, but I think there's some remarkable areas of agreement on this panel, which might be a little boring to you, but very exciting to me. I want to sort of offer an overlay that I don't need to get into very much because Frank did such a good job. But basically, to summarize, the largest factor affecting this year and future defense budgets will certainly be federal government discretionary spending related to the current deficit and the rising cost of mandatory expenditures, including servicing the debt and entitlements. He walked through the debt and the deficit, so I will not go through that. But what are the implications of this? Well, for the first, and probably most important for defense, this is negative GDP growth. A dollar is certainly worth less today. We'll see a decline in jobs, most likely over the next 2 years, and a significant reduction in non-residential investment, which drives sustainable growth. Now, historically, U.S. GDP has grown at a rate of about 3% annual rate. And as GDP grew, so would the defense budgets. This provides a means for addressing projected cost growth in manpower, operations and support, and procurement. But because economic growth and sound fiscal policy are required to maintain an adequate defense budget, the outlook is that defense will likely have to suck it up, along with the other agencies and programs during this time. Over the long term, economic growth must come first, even before defense. While military power will trump economic power in the short term, economic power will trump military power in the longer term. Federal programs, including defense, are funded with dollars. This is no surprise. Only a larger economy will permit larger allocations to these federal activities. Now, maintaining a healthy defense budget at any level, let's not even get into what level that should be right now, is impossible without reforming the big three. Stimulus and bailout spending aside, defense spending has not caused the federal government's current and projected fiscal woes. Defense has gradually declined as a percentage of GDP since the 1960s, while spending on major entitlements has more than doubled, outpacing economic growth rates over the same period. And further, they will continue to do so for decades to come. Now, you haven't heard Chris speak yet. He's a great colleague. We've talked in many fora. And we actually agree on a few key points here. The strategic overlay. America's military should be used to secure our vital national interests. We shouldn't pay for anything more than the military absolutely needs. Reform also, like Frank mentioned, which is no panacea by any means, of the acquisition process, military compensation, and federal entitlements is critical, whether the budget is $400 or $600 billion annually. Now, what's the planning, programming, and budgeting outlook? As part of this budget and policy planning process, Congress has directed that the quadrennial defense review follow from the broader national security strategy. And this is appropriate because military capabilities are not an end in themselves, but rather they are a means of providing national security. While the details of the Obama administration's national security strategy will differ from the existing strategy, the core provisions related to the defense posture should be rather predictable because they follow from our vital national interests that the U.S. must protect and that the U.S. Armed Forces play a key role in achieving that end. These vital interests, despite the consequences of time and a shifting threat environment, have remained remarkably enduring and consistent. Which leads us to the rules for exercising U.S. military power. Like American interests, the rules for when, where, and how our military should be employed have also remained relatively enduring. Because securing these interests requires decisions that inevitably places service members in harm's way, abidance by historical criteria is necessary, including the national interest, not jeopardizing more important security commitments, meeting clearly defined, decisive, attainable, and sustainable goals, congressional and public support, and allowing the armed forces to create conditions for success. Based on a national security strategy that reiterates these long-standing vital national interests, the QDR can move forward this year as part of the budget and policy process, describing the building blocks that the military will need to secure these interests. Of course, the military is not the only instrument of national power. Panels, and every panelist today will tell you this, armed forces and our civilian agencies should certainly accompany each other. But basically, in my estimation, the forthcoming QDR should live up to its core purpose of detailing the means that the military needs to meet its responsibilities, outlining the broad military capabilities required to defeat a myriad of threats and emerging challenges, as well, of course, as hedging against the unknown. To bolster its relevance, this strategy should delineate how it could be implemented on an operational level instead of creating another Washington budget-driven exercise. And because the key capability sets that the military or the nation should not sacrifice at any time are relatively stable, and because we cannot precisely foresee what the future holds, there are a guiding set of essential programmatic building blocks that can and should be identified. Strategy always changes faster than force structure. Pairing defense budgets to what Washington wants or wishes to spend can be justified by adopting a modest and restrained strategy. When demands change, as happened with the outbreak of the Korean War, strategy can be modified. But fielding forces adequate to implement abrupt changes takes years. And in the meantime, the cost of being unprepared is often measured in the lives of the men and women and compromised national security. Again, because not every threat can be predicted and procurement cycles typically take years or decades to field a particular system, the U.S. military must plan its forces around a grand strategy and hedge with specific capabilities to meet any future requirements. These core capabilities, many of which are resident in the military today, should be the mainstays of strategic planning. Now, putting in place basic building blocks will provide the military with assets that may be used to perform necessary operations as they arise. They should be sufficiently robust and redundant to permit an effective response to surprises. Now, you may have heard before the Budget Committee the recent defense testimony by CRS and CBO officials. And Stephen Daggett made some excellent points. He said, you know, with how much we're spending on the Defense Department today, base budget of about $515 billion a year, he said, why is it that money seems so tight? Because in many ways, it actually is. And you've heard Admiral Mullen say the same thing. It comes as a surprise to many people, particularly outside of Washington, when they hear, for example, that the Air Force has an annual modernization shortfall of $20 billion. Or that the Navy, like Frank said, needs an average of $8 billion or more per year in shipbuilding to reach its 313 ship fleet, or that the Army has an unfunded requirements list of about $4 billion for last year. Money seems tight because it is. The cost of nearly everything that the military has been doing has been accelerating upward too fast for even growing budgets to keep pace. Of course, the primary drivers of this are the all-volunteer force, growth in operations and maintenance accounts, which includes DoD civilians and all medical care, or actually I should say the majority of medical care, but it's also got fuel, training, transportation, facility, weapons maintenance, and more. And then finally, cost growth in weapon systems. As end strength grows in the ground forces, the average military service member is about 45% more expensive after adjusting for inflation than just 10 years ago. This doesn't include medical care for service members or their dependents. So part of the understandable rationale is that uniformed leaders consider America's all-volunteer force its most potent asset. As my friend and colleague John Guardiano notes, for this reason, because the all-volunteer force is one of our best weapons, military officials are unwilling to therefore sacrifice lives when technology can help prevent the loss of life. Primarily technology in major weapons systems. This substantial national investment in procurement and R&D since 2001 has paid off. John notes that America suffered more loss of life in World War II training exercises than in the entire Iraq War combined. But defense dollars seem scarce for other reasons. CRS testimony elucidates an often forgotten point in the defense budget explanation. Quote, the military services have to varying degrees been caught in a budget bind that is by no means entirely of their own making. Rather, it is a result in part of growing personnel costs and, the key, of changing guidance on priorities from senior decision makers, including Congress. In the first few years after the end of the Gulf War, the guidance implicitly, if not explicitly, was that our technology would save us, particularly information technology that would give U.S. forces a critical advantage. Now, faced with irregular warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, the emphasis is on larger numbers of highly trained and flexible foot soldiers. The strategic corporal, as a former Marine commandant put it, high-tech forces for, quote, traditional state-on-state, force-on-force conflicts are becoming a lesser priority. The real answer is this is not a zero-sum game. Arguing that the U.S. military should instead focus or solely focus on irregular threats and refining counterinsurgency skills, shifting from conventional and building weapons to counter current threats is a zero-sum exercise. The military must be able to counter a myriad of threats and possess unmatched capabilities in varying contingencies that are not prioritized one over the other. And a deliberate assessment of the likelihood of potential threats and enemies, of course, is required before procuring these capabilities. So with finite resources, what can be done? The cost overruns affecting the defense procurement process are no secret. During Secretary Gates's Senate hearing in January, he made an effort to address the issue and outline some steps to fix the problem. Congress, with its propensity to second-guess the Defense Department in many aspects of program management and intervene in the acquisition process with funding restrictions and earmarks, is a major contributor to the problem. While the Pentagon has a major role to play in acquisition reform, there are a number of steps Congress can take to become a better customer and to help manage cost overruns, including improving the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the acquisition system, acknowledging our procurement holiday, to which we have not yet recovered of the 1990s, was a mistake. Increasing the modernization budget specifically would help increase the overall size of future buys and drive down unit costs. Overregulation is another problem that has created entry barrier into the defense market. Careful steps toward deregulating the defense market would help create easier entry and allow new suppliers and increase competition. More competition is a better way to improve efficiency in the acquisition system. And finally, restoring a balance between research and development and procurement within the modernization account. Providing incentives for contractors to push programs out of development and actually into the hands of the military, something I saw every day as a congressional staffer. And not to be forgotten is the all things to all people problem within DoD. What is needed is to halt spiral acquisition of continuously adding new capabilities to a system. According to CRS, an attempt to build systems to perform multiple missions with maximum capabilities in every dimension is a major cost driver. Oftentimes, the DDG-1000 is an example of this gone awry. Now, there is no doubt that modernization is hobbled by affordability. Everyone from GAO to CRS to CBO to you and I know this. And often the solution is simply to make some so-called hard choices. Funding for the future shouldn't be gauged on a series of high stakes bets. The military does not have the luxury of focusing solely on conventional or irregular warfare. The adage is true also that quantity has a quality all of its own. The next few slides illustrate this wisdom, one you've seen for a little while here. While no means a panacea, avoiding modernization budget spikes and valleys affords more than simply weapons systems. It provides stability in defense planning and offers a steadier workload for those constructing them. And budget requirements change dramatically every single year, particularly when requirements stay the same on the military side. The industrial base cannot plan ahead. And this increases the cost of each system. U.S. national security is well served by a competitive industrial base, and the defense budget predictability would contribute to this effort. Since the Pentagon must pay its people first, including health care, the only big account available to serve as a bill payer is always modernization. The next two slides outline for what, just by way of background, the Army and the Air Force and their procurement, in this case of Army ground vehicles. You'll see it starting in 1980, peaking in about 1986, 87, and where we are today. The exact same thing holds true for the Navy and, of course, the Air Force. This one is Air Force fighter and attack aircraft. The irony remains that a dramatically reduced acquisition budget will lead to ever more reduced competition and interdependence among contractors. This can lead to less competition, which increases costs to the taxpayer. So, there will be no rest for the weary, also known as the new administration, given the volume and scope of immediate priorities demanding its attention and the need to hit the ground running. The military is in a crucial phase of recapitalization. War-related bills, as you've heard the chiefs testify, will come due for years after a majority of U.S. combat forces are withdrawn from Iraq. Yet supplemental spending bills will surely decline. The challenge is not the resolution of the American people, rather it's a matter of communicating national defense requirements and core objectives to policymakers and the general public. A disconnect exists between the civilian population and the day-to-day obstacles facing the military. Many Americans may not perceive the same current or future threats as defense leaders, making them unable to properly approve the types of capabilities the military must possess. I would argue, in some, that members of Congress, the President, the new administration, policy leaders like Dr. Gates, and uniformed officials should undertake the difficult task of changing public opinion, not following it, by reminding the American people that the ongoing war is not over and the stakes extend to their lives, liberty, and future prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Dr. Preble?
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to you for the invitation to come here. Thanks to the rest of the staff at FPRI, Alan and Jan, Luxembourg, the rest of you. It's my first time speaking at FPRI event. It's really a great honor to be here. And I also really want to thank and commend Frank Hoffman for writing a fine paper. It honestly was a privilege to read. I expect that many of you will soon have a chance to read a version, and it's my honor to offer some comments here briefly. When I first read the paper, I noted in the margins the many areas where Frank and I agree, but I think we can all agree that, for example, he says, deferring decisions or failing to provide a strategic framework to assess and allocate constrained resources will only generate additional cascading effects later. No disagreement there. I don't think anyone can disagree that the Defense Department must set priorities, hedge and manage risks, and consider inescapable trade-offs, and that it must strike a balance for a sustainable defense. I also commend Frank for thinking of national security in the broadest sense of the term, linking the government's long-term economic and fiscal health with its ability to defend our people and our way of life. Quote, the greatest threat to national security and our economic well-being, Frank writes, lies not in external threats or poor management of our defense resources, but in unbridled entitlement programs that have grown without effective control. You've heard now 3 people all state our agreement, but I ask, is there anyone in the audience today who disagrees with that statement? I doubt it. I would go one step further, however, fully endorsing Frank's assertion that continued government spending, including defense and other national security requirements, cannot continue at these levels indefinitely without undercutting the economic security of future generations. Not this year, not next year, not this decade perhaps, but eventually, over time. There are other elements of this paper that I think should command broad public support. I suspect that many agree, many even in this room agree, that winning the long war requires a different strategic calculus and operational capability from the Cold War. And I, for one, fully embrace Frank's further assertion that victory requires a different but not larger military. But what do most people believe? And I'm talking here about most people not in this room, most Americans. A majority of the American people do not believe that the costs of our current national strategy are outweighed by the benefits. Many, and I think most Americans, resent that our military is used primarily to protect other people's governments, other people's shores and airspace, and increasingly to rebuild other people's nations. Now, many advocates of our current course understand the risks of such a dramatic disconnect between the public and the policymakers. And Frank himself notes, the greatest imbalance in our national security framework is the distinct lack of relationship between the Pentagon's coffers and the resources that the nation is willing to apply in a sustainable way. He goes on, in pursuit of a risk-free world, we have accrued debts and obligations beyond our capacity to pay for them. I would submit to you this is largely by design. One of the leading proponents of our current grand strategy, Michael Mandelbaum, predicts that the American role in the world may depend in part on Americans not scrutinizing it too closely. But in a country which presumes some measure of popular consent, it is not realistic, and it is certainly not sustainable, sustainability being the key word today, to expect this to continue indefinitely. So when I talk about what is sustainable, it is not enough to talk about what we spend and make assumptions about what we should spend or could spend. We must also revisit those aspects of our current grand strategy that are explicitly designed to discourage others, including many countries which share our interests and our values, from spending more. And that's where I'm going to focus my remarks today. Because my concern with Frank's paper is that it goes too far and not far enough at the same time. I endorse I say again, I endorse every particular reform or realignment that Frank has put forward in my forthcoming book, The Power Problem, including reduced military forward presence, reduced strategic force levels, reductions in acquisitions for Joint Strike Fighter, reshaping the FCS, reframing the Navy's shipbuilding priorities, every single one of those. But I'm concerned that cuts on this scale without a commensurate change in grand strategy would be unwise and at some level dangerous. Frank asserts that having established a top line for the Pentagon, the next critical strategy challenge is apportioning the resources against projected challenges. This gets things backwards. Strategy should, no, must drive budgets, not the other way around. And my concern is that the strategy that Frank appears willing to embrace does not go far enough in reducing our presumed foreign commitments to ultimately close the Lippman gap. I'm very glad that Frank showed a picture of Lippman, because the Lippman gap ultimately is not just about the chronic imbalances inside the United States, within the United States. It's also about the gross mismatch between our on-paper foreign commitments and our physical military capacity and domestic political will to make good on those commitments. I favor a grand strategy that substantially restructure obsolete Cold War alliances from a set of patron-client relationships to one of cooperation on the ground of mutual self-interest and a framework of self-reliance. What grand strategy do others favor? It's unclear in Frank's paper. I'm puzzled and a bit dismayed by his claim that this is not a strategy of restraint as proposed by some academics, but one more discriminate and disciplined. So I ask, why is this not restraint? What is the difference? He writes approvingly of Colin Gray's recent study for the Strategic Studies Institute, in which Gray calls for hegemony light. Hegemony. Frank also does not explicitly disavow the benevolent global hegemony proposed by William Kristol and Robert Kagan in 1996, and that has been the foundation for U.S. foreign policy since at least 9/11, and I think even before that. Why not? Kristol and Kagan claimed in 1996 that, quote, American hegemony is the only reliable defense against a breakdown of peace and international order. The only reliable defense. Goodness, we're in a lot of trouble. Does anyone still believe that's true? Some very smart people didn't think it was true 12 years ago. Quote, William Kristol and Robert Kagan's vision of Pax Americana, Kim Holmes and John Hillen wrote, is low on strategic clarity. It was without limits or constraints. America, they concluded, must adopt a strategy of selective engagement that establishes priorities among American interests and clearly adapts means to ends. I agree that we must. So far, we have not. Frank tries, but he doesn't go far enough. And by proposing cuts without a commensurate reshaping of our grand strategy, I fear it would do more harm than good. Now, in fairness to Frank, that was not his charge, not necessarily. And, you know, challenging the core assumptions of U.S. foreign policy over the past 2 decades doesn't win many friends in Washington. I know a little bit about that. because people don't hear criticism of the U.S. hegemony, benevolent, light, or some other variation today. And let's be honest, the people that President Obama has chosen to lead his defense and foreign policy team, including Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates, James Jones, Susan Rice, broadly endorse a hegemonic strategy. Indeed, some had a hand in shaping it. But while President Obama might like to modestly slow the growth of military spending in 2010 and might consider further constraints on military spending in the out years, I predict that absent a fundamental change in our approach to foreign policy and an explicit move away from hegemony, it will be extremely difficult and certainly unwise to reduce U.S. military spending to the levels that prevailed in the first years after the end of the Cold War. Because I don't think it's fair, and I suspect others of you in the audience agree with me, to saddle our men and women in uniform with more missions and less money, and as was done in the 1990s. I'm going to skip ahead. Frank notes correctly that we have more assets devoted to protecting foreign populations than we have prepared to defend America's critical infrastructure and domestic security. Our strategy is driven more by fear of new arms races in East Asia and Middle East, more than by concerns over the long-term cost of our military spending. And it largely ignores the near-term risks that will be drawn into peripheral conflicts against our will. I have to cite at least one set of numbers. I had a whole bunch, but I shed them in the interest of time. But here are the numbers that I like to quote. Over the 10 years from 1998 to 2007, holding constant for inflation, U.S. military spending increased by 66%. Those are real terms. During that same period, military expenditures worldwide grew by half that amount, 33%. Just two countries drove most of that 33%, Russia and China. Leading U.S. allies have not kept pace. Japanese military expenditures have remained essentially flat over the last 10 years and have actually declined slightly since 2001. Germany's defense spending has declined by 8.5% over that same period. France increased 6.4% over 10 years. Even reliable allies like the UK and Israel have not kept pace with U.S. increases. So what I'm saying is that I wish Frank had married his sensible ideas about force structure, and I do want to emphasize that, with a new grand strategy, because I don't think that our experiment over the last 2 decades has achieved what it set out to do. We need a truly different strategy, a strategy that to drive towards a new global order in which other countries assume a greater responsibility for defending themselves and for dealing with regional security challenges before they become global challenges. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna, certainly not. The process of transitioning from our current unipolar order to a new multipolar order will not be easy. Other countries will be expected to bear additional costs, and many will resist. Resistance will also come from within the United States, especially from that cadre of Americans who are enamored of the idea that we can dominate the global order and that it is in our interest to do so. But the risk that American security will be undermined during this transitional period can be mitigated if we establish clear and stringent standards to guide our decisions on whether and when to use force. We can debate all day what the proper mix of military versus non-military, hard versus soft, so long as the U.S. military commands such a disproportionate share of the total amount of money that's dedicated to foreign policy, loosely defined. It's almost inevitable that any U.S. foreign policy initiative will involve the military to a considerable degree. We need criteria, frankly, to constrain the policymakers' propensity to do something. There is almost an endless drumbeat in Washington to do something. Our capacity for waging war in far-flung places and disconnected from any consideration of U.S. national interests encourages individuals and groups to come to Washington to appeal for assistance. In a political environment where those few calling for action vastly outnumber those calling for restraint, it won't be long, I predict, before Hillary Clinton or Susan Rice or Samantha Power will say to General Petraeus or Admiral Mullen, "What is the point of this superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it?" As Madeleine Albright famously said to Colin Powell. Powell, of course, reported that he nearly had an aneurysm when Albright posed this question. It's hardly surprising. He worried the superb military that he had helped to create would be turned into a hollow force with too few troops facing too many missions. He also resented, and I think many Americans resent, the presumption that American GIs were merely toy soldiers to be moved around some sort of global game board. Powell would have preferred a set of criteria similar to those promulgated by Caspar Weinberger, criteria that Powell, of course, helped to craft. I think we need a similar set of criteria today, but mine would be even more stringent than those of the Weinberger-Powell doctrine, because the strategic environment today is considerably more benign than in 1984, as Frank notes in his paper correctly, and because our presumption, I think, should be against military intervention except in very rare cases. So in conclusion, my concern is that an attempt to restrain military spending, while wise in its own right, without commensurate changes to our grand strategy, will impose onerous burdens on our men and women in uniform and will ultimately undermine our security over the long term. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure we have plenty of excellent questions that are going to be queued up, and we have a limited time. So, Frank, you get 2 minutes. And I'm going to watch this.
Yeah, watch me. I thank my fellow panelists for correcting my paper for me and helping me. There's much more agreement than I expected. I would like to have a short rejoinder to Chris's comments. I was tasked to write a defense economics paper. I tried to inoculate myself on slide 18 and in the paper by when I was making my cuts that I was doing it in a strategy-driven way with a less assertive and unilateral foreign policy. And in the paper, I do try to separate myself from Barry Rosen, and then apparently not enough from Colin Gray, whose strategy, Colin Gray's strategy is much more aggressive than me. So I'm not in line with Colin. Colin's proposing a much more benevolent, hegemonic strategy than I would support, and it's based upon a rating strategy from space and from afar that I think is inappropriate for our real needs. I'm in favor of a much more discriminate engagement, flexible, expeditionary, maneuverable, that gives us freedom of action, working through others, soft, and others is where I'd like to go, and I will expand that portion of the paper when I finalize it. That's all.
Okay, now we've come to Q&A time. One thing before that, there's been a number of mentions about papers for this. We commissioned papers from the paper givers, and those will appear at a later date, probably in Orbis, and we'll also be sending out emails or e-notes on those. Okay, now we have any questions. We're going to follow FPRI's Jeopardy rules here. That is, if you have a speech, please form it in the form of a question. Thanks. Sir?
I have two interrelated questions. The first is, aren't a lot of the figures that you show for the total defense expenditures sort of apples and oranges, because American expenditures are very heavily influenced by personnel costs, whereas the budgets of almost every other country doesn't include or includes it to a much lower extent. Even in the British, they don't include pension or health care in their defense budget. Well, our defense budget includes not only current retirement, but accrued retirements, and certainly virtually all the healthcare costs is included in that. The other issue is, isn't it a little bit disingenuous of you to be ranting against the entitlement portion of the federal budget, while maybe not necessarily yourselves, but certainly your constituencies are pushing for greater income, retirement, and health benefits for the military, which is into that budget, and yet you're trying to reduce that for the rest of the American population?
Let me address the first question, because I wasn't very clear when I talked about today, but the parity issue between, say, for example, the Chinese budget and our budget was presented properly and clearly in my presentation, using what IISS is using. You know, the Chinese aren't spending $120 billion as reflected in that chart. We give them credit so that we can get a comparison between apples and oranges. It's not done for the Russian one. Russia's probably about closer to 50 or 60 perhaps in PPP, because the manpower systems are different. And we do have a much higher cost. I mean, we have a much stronger science and technology base. We have an all-volunteer force of great quality. We have a foreign basing structure that's massive. I think Chris and I would agree, too massive.
Yes.
But some of these are matters of choice. Some of them are things that we could take alternatives to. But that's also kind of accounted for why, even when you put the two most, kind of frequent, contestants together, even when you account for inflation and some cost factor, at least with the Chinese one, I mean, you're still outspending somebody today 4-to-1, and I'm arguing for something maybe closer to 3-to-1. So I don't know if that's disingenuous or incomplete, but the apples to apples was largely done in the presentation. We could debate Chinese spending and where it's going, between me and the Heritage Foundation for a long period of time. And you might account for that over time. I didn't get your point on the second half of the question, but I think we're all being disingenuous, at least those of us of our age group, from what we're doing. The choice we're making right now is we've decided we want certain things, a drug benefit for which we've ascribed to ourselves without any taxation or revenue, not a dime applied to it. We're making choices that we're not facing up to between my mother, who's in a retirement home, and looking for her envelope at the end of every month to pay for the thing, and my kids. And what we've done, what I think is equally disingenuous, is what we've done for the last 20 years is dump the problem on our children. Because they're going to pay the debt on the national interest, not you or I. I think that's the most disingenuous thing that we've done in the last 10 years, and we've not faced up to the future, which that'll come back and hit us, because you and I at some point in time will be sitting in that nursing home and looking for some envelope to pay for it at the end of the month, and many of us don't think it's going to be there.
Alan, do we have any questions from online?
We have a question from Meg Best in the General Accounting Office. Do the panelists believe there is any benefit in moving funding for the global war on terrorism into the base budget in terms of forcing or at least airing, quotes, tough choices? Why or why not?
From the General Accountability Office now, yes. There's an argument for and against that. There's the school of thought, at least on the Hill, is that when things are in the baseline budget, they're in a timely manner, and Congress gets a lot more scrutiny, and things get integrated a little bit better by that period of time. I like separating the war costs from the baseline budget, because when the war goes away, then I know where the baseline budget's supposed to be. So I like the technique of supplemental funding, so I can see and separate those costs rather clearly. So I don't want to hide and do what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had tried to do and slide a significant portion of the supplement into the baseline, because I think it would just increase the new baseline. It would create a new floor for defense spending that after the war we'd have trouble identifying and getting at.
Yeah, let me just second that. I agree with Frank, and I think that if the problem is too little oversight or scrutiny of the supplemental appropriations, there's a solution to that. Greater scrutiny and oversight, and not assuming that these things have to be passed on a fast track, which we've assumed too much over the last 6-7 years.
I think the supplemental should be completely moved into the base budget, not meaning eliminating the use of supplementals, not necessarily a dollar for dollar assumption and absorption by the base budget, for a couple of reasons. Oversight has been weak in Congress, by Congress, since 2001 in the national security arena in general, and allowing defense budgets, when you're talking $500 billion before stimulus, that was a lot of money. You want oversight. You want the authorization process to supplement the appropriators who have extensive policy and other, subpoena capabilities to look into that, but also a couple of other things. So the oversight is key, but prioritization by Congress is something that's been lacking. I think this panel generally agrees in many facets of policymaking. In some ways, including in the defense realm, this would force more difficult choices, because if you decide you don't want to fund this or you don't want to fund that, and it's all just going into the supplemental black hole because it's moving so quickly, nobody's made that choice. So you're really just putting off hard choices. And then finally, and I think the most important, is with the assumption that war costs have become relatively predictable, and even the military says that they have, then what you've given to Congress, particularly since Democrats assumed control beginning with the 110th 2+ years ago, is a vehicle for massive domestic spending. Again, pre-stimulus, when this was an even bigger deal, where now it just doesn't seem to be. But each supplemental to pass, with an anti-war caucus and others opposed to the policy under George Bush, each supplemental required more tens of billions. So it started with something like the $40 billion domestic Christmas tree attached to the supplemental. By the last one in the first half of 2009, it was almost up to $100 billion in domestic spending on an emergency war bill, with, again, no authorizing, no oversight, no policy debate on the floor, and just rapid movement through Congress. This is not the way the public's tax dollars should be spent.
Sir?
Yes, this is for all panelists. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Office of Force Transformation and Business Transformation in DoD, and whether or not the rates of change and their either mandate for transformation are complementary, or one limits the other?
I'm familiar with both offices. I'm kind of stumped for
It's been a while since I was in OSD, maybe 6 years now. I frankly, I thought the office force transformation was gone. So.
Alan from cyberspace.
I guess the first question is mine on terms of methodology. What the chart reflects from the strategy that I attempted to outline, from the priorities, which I agreed with Colonel Hammis on many of his priorities, was an historical allocation based on looking at the Cold War, looking at the what we've done over the last 15 years, and where I wanted to take the department. So I want to invest more in disruptive technologies because there's a demand for that. I want to increase capabilities for regular warfare, and then I have to maintain and hedge against, major high-end warfare with multi-capable forces. That was the methodology for allocating that over time, plus reflecting the cuts that I had identified. So it's not the same budget level. It gets reduced down to 67% for the multi-capable forces. That's about as specific as the methodology gets. And I commend Dr. Krepinovich's recent monograph on that topic that I adapted it from. I had slightly different priorities than he did, and reflected those in my allocation to maintain the kind of force structure that I think is appropriate for the 21st century. And then, when the questioner reads the paper, hopefully it'll be a little more evident than the drive-by shooting of the slides.
Let me answer the second part of the second question, because a lot of times you do hear the key defense of a hegemonic strategy is that the functioning of the globalized trading system is dependent upon a single hegemon. So to the extent that that is the presumption, then I think that has driven U.S. policy and planning over the last 2 decades or so, but I think that's simply false. While it's true that the United States is inextricably connected to the global trading order and will continue to be, we are only one of many beneficiaries. And yet right now we are paying a disproportionate share of the costs, with most of the rest of the world, including some countries we don't like very much, essentially free riding on our providing those that security. I think, again, over a long term, medium to long term, a more sustainable strategy is one that more equitably distributes the burdens of policing the commons, and even someone like myself who believes in a more restrained strategy sees our proper role as defending the approaches to our to North and South America, which would be half the world after all, and we could leave the rest of the world to the rest of the world to figure out how to sort out. We have to get out of the mindset that we are the only country in the world that are capable of doing all of these things, that our allies, again, including people who do share our values and our system of government and our commitment to trade, that they are congenitally incapable of doing more to defend themselves. That has been the mindset that's guided our policy for the last 2 decades.
I want to thank the Morristown team. I had the luxury of traveling up to that facility just a few months ago. I think the second question, first part, was a fair one. We all pick on the procurement holiday of the 90s very often for good reason. And it's not just President Clinton's fault. It was actually a Republican-led Congress that endorsed and approved reducing our U.S. military by 1/3 of what it is. What it was in 2001 from what it was assuming office. So this was a collective decision, a public policy decision by the president and Congress in the 90s. But yes, I would argue that primarily, of course, in modernization, that the reason so many of the bills are because they were pushed to the right and deferred for so long that it's why the U.S. military has not yet fully recovered from the so-called peace dividend and the procurement holiday from the 90s, and why it's so severe today, why recapitalization alone resetting of equipment alone will not be enough, but actually recapitalization and modernization is required because in many ways the military that went into Iraq in 2001 was the military that Reagan built. So it is time. It's time to do these things. And the strategic planning, I would argue, of a peace dividend was actually a collective failure.
Sir.
Good morning. Mayor Tate Westbrook, named staff. On the morning of September 11, 2001, then Vice Admiral Mullen was in Chief of Naval Operations. Then CNO's office, pitching the requirement that was proposed at the time to cut 2 carrier strike groups and 2 ESGs. That was on the morning of September 11th. Of course, as we know, the airplanes then hit and the intoxication of supplemental appropriations began. Now that we are looking at, and I'm in the budget office, we're currently looking at the hard choices that Mr. Hoffman suggests. How does one suggest, given the trend of Congress, other than during the post-Cold War drawdown, of not always accepting prudent reductions that the Pentagon might propose, ranging from, the very generous 3.9% pay increase that all of us on active duty here in this room enjoyed this year, which several U.S. taxpayers might be furious if they were those unemployed. On the other end of high end might be extra congressional investments in missile defense programs that were in excess of what the Missile Defense Agency asked for. How do you recommend, specifically to Mr. Hoffman, but generally to the whole panel, advising defense planners on managing their message to the legislative branch when we do end up making these hard choices to offset the inevitable defense of the argument that they'll probably make of defending the U.S. Industrial base as a reason for continuing and if not expanding some investments in those areas? Thank you.
Well, I think you and I share some concerns about the industrial base. There's a minimum requirement in several areas, particularly in aircraft. I think we probably have a sufficiently robust base in that area, but you need to watch elements of the industrial base, the design teams, the experimentation, the prototyping things. I'm concerned in the crush for dollars. The political element is always heavily favored towards existing production cycles that have a lot of metal bending, people coming out the line, particularly for the Navy. The DDG-51 out of Bath, Maine's in production. There's a lot of political consensus to try to keep those things, and that's where you get yourself into the near term versus the long term. You eat the seed corn, you cut the R&D, you cut the design teams, you cut the investments that you've been pushing in technology with engines, composite hulls, command and control, missiles and type things, and you end up producing large aircraft carriers or existing production lines that may not be contributing to the future as much. And that's part of the leadership challenge of people like Vice Admiral then Mullen, and now Admiral Mullen's been doing that. They're up on the Hill trying to explain those things, and some of that gets done in hearings, and some of that gets done in closed doors where they have these kind of honest discussions and try to find this balance that goes on. I'm pretty concerned, particularly about the FY10 budget. There's a lot of discussion for cuts. I notice they're very platform-centric. They're near-term things, things we can shut down that will save some dollars in the immediate period of time. I'm concerned that we might go too far, hurt the yards. That's why we're having this particular panel. There's an investment level that we need to maintain in the future in production and design. I like Dr. Biddle's comment about keeping the design teams and the technology people kind of focused, but take a very close look at how much is actually required. I don't know if we have any kind of measurement of what kind of capacity we really need to have. There's a presumption we have excess in some areas, but that needs to be determined. But this is what we're really concerned why Mike and I kind of conspired to have this kind of panel is, we need to maintain a procurement line. I see people playing politics, shutting things down or keeping things going for the wrong thing. And over the long term, that hurts all of us. It hurts the budget overall. It hurts the credibility, I think, that the Pentagon and the Congress have with the American people right now, that we can actually manage defense effectively.
If we could come up with an answer to your question, I'd be out of a job. So that is my long-term goal here, is to do exactly what you've said. I consider myself sort of a translator for the department to the Hill and vice versa. And I've seen this from both sides. Just a couple of examples. I remember the dreaded PBD 753 and the chaos that reeked on the Hill, and we basically cut everything in half, or if not more, everything from F-22 to DDG 1000, 12 to 7, which ultimately has led to its truncation. Every major weapons program. And so what you had in the program, budgeting documents and guidance that are internal to the department, it's leaked to the Hill. And so even before the president's budget comes over the first Monday of February, you have 435 members in the House and 100 in the Senate already against you. So it sets the tone for the year, and it's problematic. I've seen it from the department's side on the Hill, where DOD doesn't want to fund an alternate engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. It wants to free up some money. DOD wants modest co-payment increases for prescription drugs and TRICARE. We're talking $3, a month or whatever the proposal was. And over and over and over, Congress comes back and says, nope, we're not going to do that. We don't want to increase TRICARE. We don't want to. We want to give you a higher pay raise. You're going to fund the alternate engine for various reasons, and I'm not arguing whether they're compelling or not. But not allowing the Defense Department to find these so-called savings, it was a miracle, frankly, that BRAC 2005 made it through to the end. So it's a classic tension, and it's definitely a worthy question. I would argue that the groundwork is on a staff level in the department. That would be action officer on the Hill. That would be staffer, personal and professional staff level on the committee, and getting buy-in, frankly, before. It's not just Admiral Mullen and Gates, sitting in front of the dais. It's frankly on that conversation in private. Buy-in from the Hill will reap you benefits far beyond the posture hearings.
I agree with what Frank and Mackenzie have said. I'd just add one thing. I have a fairly, well, I don't think it's too naive, but I don't think that defense spending should be used as a job program. Please note how I worded that. I'm not naive enough to think that defense spending is not used as a jobs program. Of course it is. And there's only so much you're going to be able to do to take the politics out of politics. I think it would be helpful, however, if most of this spending was sold within some kind of overarching strategic framework, and based on the presumption that the defense budget may have knock-on effects and employment in the short term, but its purpose is to make us secure. And so I think most Americans presume, and I think correctly, that the Defense Department, that the Pentagon is focused above all else on keeping us secure. When the Congress does things contrary to Pentagon's wishes, there's an opportunity there for the Pentagon to call them out, if you will. And I would like to see maybe a little bit more of that. I also understand the danger of biting the hand that feeds you, quite literally. So good luck with that.
No? Okay, I'll take this opportunity from the moderator's imperative here. Frank, how would you kind of respond to perhaps criticisms that, I know you had the 2.5, what was your 2.5 armies comparison? Yeah. Okay.
It's the triple double enemy standard.
Triple double enemy standard. Sounds like something at KFC or something. How would you respond to critics, and I'm not saying that I'm making this argument, but some critics might say that, say the Russians have to cover the ground between first base and second base, and the Chinese have to cover maybe, say, center field to left field, yet we have to cover the entire surface of the field. How would you kind of respond to that sort of criticism about sort of our defense spending vis-a-vis other competitors or potential competitors?
Yeah. Well, this gets to the issue of there's a line in that Lippmann test, is that you have to create enough power and have a surplus in reserve, and then we get to a question of how much is reserve. I like the history behind the two-power standard of the Royal Navy, which is what I kind of constructed this two-enemy threat. Colin Gray in a recent paper said that America must have a threat. We must name the threat. It's probably in Asia. It's probably a large landmass power, and then it would help the political question of saying what you want to do, and you'd build a military for that, and it might be an Air Force, and a Navy ready to redo Warplane Orange in the Pacific. So I like the idea of having a clear threat. I don't like naming it in strategy documents, which was why I've written very positively about the maritime strategy, because we didn't overhype it and into a big problem. But here internally, trying to size things and give some degree, I thought it would be useful perhaps to name two threats that we talk about in this town and be adult-like about that. Look at how much they spend, and then figure out, okay, if they combine their resources in two different parts of the world, and we had to cover that, how big do we need to be? And I think when you're 3 times bigger than your 2 closest competitors combined, that's a hell of a lot more surplus than Britain ever had in its period of time. I do acknowledge that China's in one theater and Russia's probably going to be in a different area. They're covering a different place of the globe. China will increasingly have global interests, so they're just not a regional power. They'll be in the Middle East, they'll be in Africa, they'll be on both sides of Africa, and they're in South America as well. But I think that the margin that I've identified there, which could be a tool that could, if China increases its defense spending more, we would just continue to match that. So I think the 3-to-1 ratio is how I'm trying to answer the surplus of reserve, the fact that we have an all-volunteer force, that we might have a larger basing structure, and we need to provide a preponderance of power with something left in the tank. And I think outspending somebody by 3-to-1 puts the onus back on the Pentagon. Explain to me what $500 billion, can't do. Richard Betts put that out in Foreign Affairs not too long ago. So that's the short answer.
Can I add one thing to that? Totally independent of the military strategic planning, diplomatically, it would seem that your object should be in not seeing those 2 countries join forces.
Mackenzie, did you want to add anything? No. Alan, do we have any last questions?
No more from online?
General Dunlap, I'm disappointed. Send the word out to General Dunlap.
I'll let him know.
We've been let down.
Okay.
This is the first.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel today.